What use are eyes when the truth is etched in screams? What good is freedom to a soul shackled by a king's fear? And how does a prophecy die when the one who uttered it is buried alive, yet still breathes? In the silent, stone-cold heart of the Moon Temple's tallest spire, the answers have been festering for 20 years. And tonight, they begin to whisper. The darkness was not an absence for Morana. It was a presence. It had weight, texture, a taste of cool, damp stone and ancient dust. It was the only world her remaining senses had known for 2 decades, a world bounded by 10 paces in one direction and 5 in the other. The air in the high tower cell was perpetually still, save for the faint, mournful song of the wind whistling through a narrow slit in the wall, a window that offered no light, only sound. 81 years had carved their map upon her face, but the most profound marks were the 2 smooth, sunken scars where her eyes had once been. The royal physicians had been thorough, searing the sockets with hot iron after the king's decree. They had taken the windows to her soul, believing it would shutter the visions they feared. They were fools. The visions had only grown sharper, turning inward, painting the back of her eyelids with futures written in fire and blood. She sat on a rough-hewn cot, her spine straight despite the weight of years and imprisonment. Her fingers, gnarled like old roots, traced the familiar grooves in the stone floor. A sudden, violent shiver racked her frail frame. It was not from the cold. A shadow, moving where no shadow should be, not cast by fire or moon, but born from the very stone. It drips from the ceiling of a grand hall, pooling around a throne of gold. A crown topples, rolls, and comes to rest in the blackness, its jewels extinguished. The vision faded, leaving a metallic tang of dread on her tongue. It was coming, the thing she had foretold, the thing for which she had been condemned. The heavy, iron-banded door at the far end of her cell groaned open, shattering the profound silence. A sliver of torchlight from the corridor beyond cut through the black, a painful, useless blade to her sightless gaze. The familiar, hesitant footfalls of Kalen, the young guardsman, echoed in the small space. "Seer." His voice was low, a forced formality barely masking a natural gentleness. He placed a wooden bowl of thin gruel and a clay cup of water on the floor by the door, as was the ritual. The scent of unseasoned oats and the faint, oily smoke of his torch reached her. Morana did not turn. "You are afraid, child of the guard." Kalen stiffened. "I am not afraid of you, old woman." "Not of me," she corrected, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "You are afraid of the silence in the West Wing, of the way the torchlight flickers for no reason in the empty hall of banners. You fear the stories the other guards tell in hushed tones about him." A sharp intake of breath. How could she know? He had just come from that very duty, his skin crawling with an unease he couldn't explain. He had told no one. "The shadow that whispers," Morana continued, tilting her head as if listening to a distant melody. "They say he walks the lower corridors now, that he drinks the breath from sleeping men. A foolish tale spun to explain a fear they feel but do not understand." She finally turned her scarred face towards him. "Your fear, however, is specific. You saw something. A man, one of the stable hands, standing motionless in the rain last night. His eyes were empty, not dead, empty, as if something had been scooped out." Kalen took an involuntary step back, his hand going to the hilt of his short sword. It was true. He had seen old man Hemlock by the well, staring into the void, rainwater streaming down his unblinking face. When Kalen had shaken him, the man had simply walked away without a word. How do you know this?" he whispered, his professional detachment crumbling. "I do not see as you see, boy. I perceive. The world is a tapestry of whispers, and your fear is a shout in the silence." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the cold air. "The stable hand is not sick. He is a vessel, an echo, and he is not the only one. Tell me, guardsman, when you walk your rounds tonight, listen closely. Do you hear the stones breathing?" Before Kalen could form a reply, a different sound froze the blood in his veins. It was a faint, sibilant whisper that seemed to come not from Morana, but from the walls themselves. It had no discernible words, only a chilling, rhythmic cadence, like a serpent's sigh. Morana. Kalen spun around, torch held high, illuminating the barren stone. There was nothing there. Who said that? Morana had gone perfectly still. A slow, terrifying smile stretched across her thin, cracked lips. It was not a smile of joy, but of grim, long-awaited vindication. See, the whisper came again, slithering through the cracks in the mortar, coiling around the iron bars. He is here, Morana said, her voice barely audible. The god they denied, the darkness I prophesied. He has been sleeping in the foundations of this very temple, and now he is awake. The torch in Kalen's hand guttered violently, the flames twisting into unnatural, sapphire hues before returning to orange. The whispering ceased as suddenly as it had begun, leaving a silence more deafening than before. Kalen stood, heart hammering against his ribs, his training useless against this unseen foe. He looked at the old, blind woman chained in the darkness. They had burned her eyes and locked her away to silence the truth. But as the echo of that unearthly whisper hung in the air, a horrifying realization dawned on him. Morana was the only one who could truly see what was coming. He fled then, the heavy door slamming shut behind him, plunging Morana back into her sacred darkness. But this time, the darkness was different. It was alive, and it knew her name. King Theron of Silver Spire did not sleep. Sleep was a luxury he had forfeited 20 years ago, on the day the blind seer had looked upon his newborn son and spoken not of glory, but of a shadow that would drink the sun from the sky. Now, the shadows in his own chambers were enough to keep him awake. He stood at the arched window of his private solar, looking down upon the city that slumbered under a brittle moon. The moon temple's central spire, a needle of pale obsidian, pierced the sky, a constant, accusing reminder of the prophecy he had tried to bury in its deepest cell. The air in the room was thick with the scent of beeswax candles and the cloying aroma of mulled wine, untouched on the table beside him. A crown topples, rolls, and comes to rest in the blackness. The fragment of his own nightmare flashed behind his eyes. It was always the same. The cold of the obsidian throne seeping through his robes, the weight of the crown becoming unbearable, and then the shadow, a formless, hungry thing, oozing from the corners of the throne room to claim it all. Your Majesty. The voice, smooth as polished river stone, came from the doorway. Lord Malachar, the king's chief advisor, stood silhouetted against the torchlight of the corridor. He was a gaunt man, his face all sharp angles and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He moved with a silent, predatory grace that Theron had once found reassuring. Now he wasn't sure. Malachar, Theron rasped, not turning from a window. The city is quiet. On the surface, sire, Malachar replied, stepping into the room. But there are murmurs, strange tales from the lower districts, people speaking of bad dreams, of seeing figures in the periphery of their vision that vanish when they turn. A stable hand was found this morning, catatonic, his mind seemingly wiped clean. Theron's knuckles whitened as he gripped the windowsill. An empty-eyed man, the superstitious ramblings of peasants. The winter has been long. Minds grow feeble in the cold. Perhaps, Malachar conceded, though his tone suggested otherwise. He stopped a few feet from the king. Yet, it was a seer's ramblings that planted this seed of fear in the first place, was it not? The source of the rot remains, festering in stone. While the root survives, the weed will always grow back. The king finally turned. His face, once handsome and strong, was now a mask of weary paranoia, etched deep with lines of fear. Morana is a broken old woman. She has no power. Does she not? Malachar's gaze was unwavering. She prophesied a breathing stone. Last night, young Kalen, the guardsman assigned to her tower, reported hearing whispers from the very walls of her cell, whispers that called her name. A cold dread, colder than the stone floor, seeped into Theron's bones. The stones are breathing. He had heard the tales from the guards. He had dismissed them. But now, from the lips of his most trusted advisor, they took on a terrifying weight. "What are you suggesting?" the king asked, his voice hollow. "The people need a show of strength, your majesty. Not just a king who locks away his fears, but one who destroys them. The prophecy was a poison. We have contained it for 20 years. It is time for the antidote." Malachar let the words hang in the air, heavy and sharp. A public execution. Let the people see the so-called seer burn. Let them see that there is no shadow that cannot be banished by the light of the royal pyre. It will silence the whispers, both in the streets and in your own mind. The idea was monstrous. It was also seductive. To be finally free of her. To see the threat physically eradicated. To prove, once and for all, that he was the master of this kingdom's fate, not a prisoner of an old woman's words. Before he could answer, the doors to the solar burst open. Prince Theron, the very son whose birth had prompted the fateful prophecy, strode in. At 20, he was everything his father had been, broad-shouldered, with a warrior's stance and a face of fierce, impatient pride. He wore a light armor, as if always ready for a fight his father refused to wage. "Father." The prince's voice was a clash of steel, ignoring Malachar completely. "The patrols are reporting more of these. Empty ones. They wander the streets at night. My men are on edge. They need orders. Clear orders. Not whispers and doubts." "The king was just issuing a clear order, my prince," Malachar interjected smoothly. "We were discussing the final resolution to the problem of the seer Morana." The prince's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, narrowed. "The witch in the tower? You still cower from her words." He spat the question at his father, his disdain palpable. Locking her away was an act of fear. Burning her is an act of desperation. A true king would let her rot and prove her wrong with strength, not with fire. "This is what your fear has reduced you to. Listening to this, spider?" He gestured contemptuously at Malachar. "Mind your tongue, boy." Theron snapped, his own fear curdling into rage under his son's judgment. "My tongue speaks what the entire court thinks," the prince shot back. "You are so terrified of a phantom from an old woman's mouth that you cannot see the real threats festering in your own halls." His gaze swept over Malachar before returning to his father. "I will not have my men partake in the murder of a blind crone to soothe your nightmares. Deal with your ghost, father. I will deal with the shadows in the city." With a final, scathing look, the prince turned on his heel and stormed out, leaving a silence more violent than any shout. King Theron stood trembling, caught between the viper's counsel of his advisor and the scathing condemnation of his heir. Malachar watched him, a faint, unreadable smile playing on his thin lips. "The prince is young, sire," Malachar said softly. "He believes strength is only found in the sword. He does not understand that the most potent threats are those that poison the mind first. The execution is not just for the people. It is for the stability of your reign, for your legacy." Down below in the city, a dog began to howl, a long, lonely sound that was soon joined by others, a dissonant chorus rising to the palace walls. Theron looked out the window again, but now he saw not a sleeping city, but a kingdom waiting, holding its breath, and in the highest tower of the temple, the root of all his fears remained, listening to the hounds and the whispers, waiting for the king's next, fateful move. The world had shrunk to the size of a grain of sand, and within it, a universe was screaming. Morana sat motionless in her cell, but her consciousness was adrift, a leaf caught in a psychic gale. The whispering one's voice was no longer a single thread of sound from the stones. It had become a web, connecting every shadowed corner of Silver Spire, and she was the spider at its center, feeling every tremor. A young mother in the lower districts, jolting awake from a nightmare, her hand flying to her throat as she hears the floorboards creak with a rhythm that is not her house settling. A guardsman on the outer wall, peering into the pre-dawn fog, convinced for a heart-stopping moment that the mist has coalesced into a reaching, many-fingered hand. The visions were sharper, more visceral than any she had known before her blinding. They were not prophecies of a distant future. but a live tapestry of the city's accelerating dread, fed to her through Umbral's growing awareness. It was a torrent, and she was the conduit, her mind straining under the onslaught. Then a new vision sliced through the chaos, clear and cold as sharded glass. It was not of the common folk, but from the very heart of the power that had condemned her. She saw the Moon Temple's central sanctum, not through the eyes of a devotee, but through a filter of shifting, oily darkness. The air was thick with incense, and High Priest Valerius was conducting the dawn canticle, his hands raised to the effigy of the lunar goddess. His voice was a sonorous baritone, filled with pious authority. The acolytes and sisters knelt around him, their heads bowed. But through Umbral's sight, Morana saw what they could not. As Valerius chanted, a slick, black stain began to spread across the pristine white of his ceremonial robes. It did not originate from the outside. It seeped from within him, from his very heart, crawling outwards like a spill of primordial tar. It pulsed in time with the whispers in her cell. His face, beatific and serene to his congregation, was, in this other sight, a rigid mask of ecstatic surrender. The darkness was not consuming him. He was welcoming it, embracing it, finding in its void a perverse reflection of the absolute power he craved. The vision shifted. She saw him later, in his private chambers, kneeling not before the goddess, but in the center of a circle drawn with ash. He was whispering, not prayers, but promises. Promises of souls, of silence, of a kingdom ready to be remade in a darker image. And the shadows in the room leaned in, drinking his words. Morana's breath hitched. She had always believed Umbral's influence was an external force, a creeping doom from the deep places of the world. But this was a cancer from within. The very institution built to uphold light and order was its primary vessel. Valerius wasn't a victim. He was a willing accomplice. The keystone of the arch was rotten, and the whole temple was poised to collapse. The heavy door groaned open. Kalen entered, his steps slower, more hesitant than before. The scent of fear clung to him more pungently than the smell of torch smoke and cold steel. He placed a bowl of gruel down without a word. The silence between them was different now, charged, a tangible thing. "The High Priest," Morana said, her voice cutting the quiet like a blade. It was not a question. Kalen froze. "What of him?" "He wears his faith like a shroud, but beneath it, he kneels to a different god." She turned her scarred face towards the young guard. "You feel it, don't you? The wrongness that has taken root in the temple. It is not in the dungeons or the forgotten crypts. It sits on the high altar." "You speak treason," Kalen whispered, but there was no conviction in it. Only a dawning horror that the unsettling feeling he'd carried since his last watch, a feeling of being watched from within the holy walls themselves, was being given a voice. "I speak truth," she countered. "The stone you fear is not just breathing, it is speaking, and Valerius is its most eloquent disciple." She paused, letting the terrifying implications settle. "The king plans to make a move against me. He listens to the spider, Malachur, but the greater danger is not the pyre they might light for me. It is the shadow already dancing in the heart of the temple. Watch him, Kalen. Watch Valerius. See how the light does not touch his eyes anymore." Just then, a new sensation prickled at the edges of her awareness, fed to her through the web. It was a familiar presence, laced with a new, chilling purpose. Footsteps, measured and sure, were approaching her tower. Not the hurried, fearful steps of a junior guardsman, nor the heavy, armored tread of the regular watch. These were the steps of authority, the crisp, rhythmic click of sanctified heels on stone. Valerius. He was coming. Morana's lips curved into a ghost of a smile, a bitter, terrible thing. "He knows I see him," she murmured, more to herself than to Kalen. "The pupil has felt the gaze of the blind." Kalen, his face pale, looked from the seer to the door, his hand instinctively resting on his sword hilt. The conflict in his eyes was a war between his duty, his fear, and the terrifying truth he could no longer deny. The enemy was not at the gates. He was already inside, and he was coming for the one person who could perceive his true face. Kaelin's world had fractured. The solid stone of duty and doctrine he had built his life upon was now shifting sand. The king was a paranoid shadow, the prince a storm of contempt, and the high priest. Morana's words echoed in his mind. He kneels to a different god. The air in the barracks, once smelling of oiled leather and honest sweat, now felt thick with unspoken fears and the lingering scent of the strange, cold incense that seemed to cling to Valerius's robes. He couldn't confront the high priest. He was a mere guardsman, but he could no longer just stand watch, a sentinel for a truth that was being suffocated by lies. Morana's command, "Watch him," was a seed that had taken root, but watching was a passive thing. He needed to know. His feet carried him not to his post, but to the Moon Temple's outer cloisters, a place of serene arches and murmuring fountains where the junior acolytes often studied. He found her where he hoped he would. Sister Alara, seated on a stone bench, a heavy tome of liturgy open on her lap. Her face, usually a picture of serene devotion, was pinched with a worry that mirrored his own. She looked up as he approached, her eyes, the color of a summer forest, widening in surprise. "Kaelin, is something wrong? The seer?" "The seer lives," he said, his voice low. He sat beside her, the stone cold even through his woolen trousers. "But she speaks of a sickness in the temple itself." Alara's gaze darted around instinctively before returning to his. The stories, the whispers from the lower city. The guards speak of them too. "It's more than stories, Alara." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Morana, she sees things. She knew about the stable hand. She knows about the high priest." A flicker of fear crossed Alara's face. "Kaelin, this is dangerous talk. The high priest is the voice of the goddess on earth." "Is he?" Kaelin's question was blunt, desperate. "When was the last time you felt the goddess's presence in his sermons?" "I feel only a hunger, a coldness. Morana says the light doesn't touch his eyes anymore." Alara was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the gold leaf lettering on the page. She had felt it. The way Valerius's blessings had begun to feel like curses. The way his focus had shifted from compassion to control. She had attributed it to the stress of the times, to the king's instability. But now, "What would you have me do?" she finally whispered. "There is a place," Kaelin said, his heart hammering. "The forbidden scriptorium, the sealed section of the library. Brother Fenris holds the keys." Alara gasped. "The Black Archives." "Kaelin, that knowledge is sealed for a reason. It contains heresies, accounts of old cults, blasphemous texts from before the lunar ascendancy. What if the thing Morana warned about isn't new?" Kaelin pressed. "What if it's something old? Something the temple thought it had erased? We need to know what we are facing. Please, Alara." He saw the war within her, a lifetime of obedience against the gnawing certainty that the foundation of her faith was cracking. Finally, she nodded, swift, decisive motion. "Brother Fenris is old, and he sees more than he speaks. He has always been kind to me. I will try." Brother Fenris was so ancient, he seemed to be made of the same dust that covered the scrolls in his care. He resided in a small, paper-cluttered cell adjacent to the main library, his back permanently stooped from a lifetime of bending over texts. When Alara found him, he was meticulously repairing a damaged vellum page with hands that trembled with age, yet possessed a surgeon's precision. "Brother," Alara began, her voice trembling slightly, "we seek understanding." Fenris did not look up. "Understanding is a dangerous quest, child. It often leads to places from which one cannot return." "The high priest," Kaelin started, but Fenris held up a hand, silencing him. He finally set his tools down and fixed them with a gaze that was startlingly sharp and clear in his wrinkled face. "Valerius seeks a power the goddess denied him. He knocks on a door that should remain closed." He sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "You seek the Umbral, the eater of whispers, the god that slept." The names hung in the air, cold and final. "It is real." Alara breathed, her face pale. All gods are real in their way, Fenris said cryptically. Some are simply hungrier than others. He stood, moving with a slow, pained grace to a heavy oak door banded with black iron. From a chain around his neck, he produced a single blackened key, the temple's greatest shame and its most guarded secret. The Church of the Moon did not defeat Umbral. We made a pact. We buried it, deep in the foundations of this very temple, and promised it silence and oblivion. In return, it slept. Our faith, our prayers, were not worship. They were a lullaby, and Valerius has stopped singing. The lock turned with a loud, definitive clunk. The air that rushed out was stale, and carried the scent of decayed leather and something else, something metallic and cold. The room within was small, its shelves crammed with scrolls and codices bound in what looked like darkened, tanned skin. Fenris went directly to a specific pedestal, upon which rested a single, open folio. The pages were covered in intricate, spiraling script that seemed to move if stared at for too long. The Umbral Concordat, Fenris whispered. It is not a god of evil, not in the way the sermons preach. It is a god of negation, of silence, of truths too terrible to bear. It feeds on fear, on doubt, on the secrets we bury in our own hearts. Valerius believes he can channel it, use it to purge the kingdom of weakness, and make himself the sole, absolute power. He is a fool. You cannot channel the void. You can only be consumed by... Kalen stared at the page, his eyes drawn to a chilling illustration, of vast, formless darkness, and before it, a line of kneeling figures, their features blurred, offering up not objects, but wispy, screaming semblances of their own faces, their memories, their identities. The echoes, Kalen murmured. It's taking their minds. It is making them empty vessels, Fenris corrected grimly, so it may one day fill them. Alara, her hand over her mouth, pointed to a passage, and the seer, the unblinking eye, shall be the conduit. For only one who has embraced the darkness within can gaze upon the darkness without. The three of them stood in the silent, cursed room, the weight of the forbidden knowledge pressing down on them. The prophecy was not just a prediction of doom. It was a roadmap. Valerius wasn't just trying to silence Morana. In his arrogance, he was trying to use her. He needed her sight to navigate the tempest he was unleashing, and they were the only ones who knew. The king feared a phantom, the prince scorned a shadow, but the true battle was here, in the heart of the faith, for the soul of a blinded seer. The knowledge from the black archives was a poison and an antidote burning in Kalen's gut. He and Alara had agreed to secrecy, their shared truth a fragile, dangerous bond. Brother Fenris had retreated back into his dusty silence, a sentinel of a doomed past. But the world outside the library walls was changing, warping under the pressure of the awakening truth. It began subtly, a shift in the city's hum, the usual cacophony of Silver Spire, the hawkers' cries, the clang of the blacksmiths, the chatter of housewives, seemed muted, as if a blanket of wool had been thrown over the streets. In its place was a new sound, a low, pervasive whisper that was not quite a sound at all, but a vibration in the teeth, a prickle on the back of the neck. Morana felt it first, of course. In her cell, torrent of visions narrowed to a chilling, focused stream. She no longer saw random fears. She saw a pattern, a spreading stain. A baker kneading dough, his hands moving in a frantic, repetitive rhythm, his eyes fixed on the flour-dusted table, whispering the same phrase over and over. The salt is ash, the ash is salt. Two children skipping rope in a narrow alley, their chant not a nursery rhyme, but a string of nonsensical, guttural syllables that made the stray cats hiss and arch their backs. An old woman, sitting at her window, meticulously plucking the feathers from a dead crow, her movements jerky and precise, her mouth moving in silent conversation with the empty air. They were the echoes. They were not violent, not aggressive. They were absent. Their consciousness had been scoured away, leaving behind a hollow shell that Umbral's was beginning to fill with its static. They were the proof of the Concordat's breakdown, the lullaby replaced by a waking scream. King Theron's response was as brutal as it was futile. From his solar, he heard the rising tide of panic in the reports from his captains. He saw it not as a spiritual plague, but as an insurrection of the mind. "Round them up," he roared at a cowering lieutenant. "These empty ones. Gather them in the square before the temple. Let the people see that disorder is met with order." And so, the city guard, their own nerves frayed, moved through the streets. They did not meet resistance. The echoes went willingly, placidly, their empty eyes staring through their captors. Soon, the great plaza before the Moon Temple was filled with a silent, shuffling crowd of dozens. They stood motionless, a grotesque parody of a congregation, their collective stillness more unnerving than any riot. The common people gathered at the edges of the square, their faces a mixture of fear, pity, and revulsion. The air was thick with tension. Prince Theron, watching from the steps of the palace, with a company of his own hand-picked men, spat on the cobblestones. "Fools, you cannot arrest a sickness. You cannot shackle a shadow." He turned to his lieutenant. "My father rules with fear, but fear is what feeds this thing. We will find its source and cut it out with steel." But the true response came from the temple itself. The great bronze door swung open, and High Priest Valerius emerged, resplendent in his white and silver robes. He looked out over the crowd of echoes, and a strange, beatific smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of compassion, but of satisfaction, of harvest. He raised his hands, not in blessing, but in a gesture of reception. "Behold," his voice boomed, amplified by the acoustics of the plaza, and something else, something colder, the faithless, those whose souls have grown weak and succumbed to the whispers of doubt. They are a lesson to you all. The goddess demands purity, and in its absence, only silence remains." As he spoke, Kaelin, watching from a side street with Alara, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Valerius was not condemning the echoes. He was presenting them as a natural consequence, a divine punishment that, perversely, validated his own authority. He was weaving the horror into his narrative of control. And then, the most chilling thing happened. As one, the crowd of echoes turned their heads towards Valerius. Their mouths, hundreds of them, opened in unison, and from them came not a scream, not a plea, but a perfect, harmonious whisper. It was the same sibilant, rhythmic cadence that Kaelin had heard in Morana's cell, the voice of the stones, now given a chorus of human throats. It was a sound of allegiance, a greeting to their master. The crowd of onlookers recoiled in terror. The king's guards tightened their grip on their spears, their faces pale. Even Prince Theron took a step back, his confidence momentarily shaken by the sheer, unnatural spectacle. Valerius stood before his silent choir, his eyes closed, basking in the dreadful symphony. He was not trying to cure the city. He was showcasing its infection. He was demonstrating that he, and the power he served, were now the dominant force in Silver Spire. In her tower, Morana heard the chorus through the web of whispers. It was a wave of psychic force, a declaration of war. She saw it all through the hollow eyes of the echoes, the terrified crowd, the impotent king, the furious prince, and the triumphant high priest. The battle for the city was not going to be fought with swords and spears. It was already lost. The war had moved into the realm of the mind and the soul, and the battlefield was now the very foundation of the world she had once tried to save. The stone of Morana's cell was no longer a prison. It was a conduit. The chorus of the echoes in the plaza had been a key, turning a lock deep within the world's foundation, and now the power of the Umbral flowed through her with the force of a tidal wave. She did not resist. After 20 years of stagnant darkness, this terrifying current was a form of liberation. She let it pull her under, down into the abyss of memory, to the root of all her sorrow, the scent of hot iron and myrrh, the cold, polished floor of the Moon Temple's sanctum against her knees. She was younger, her eyes, vivid and sharp, staring up at the faces of power. King Theron, his brow furrowed with fear disguised as rage, Lord Malachar, a spider observing his web, and High Priest Valerius, his features a mask of pious condemnation. Speak the words of your false vision again, which Valerius had commanded, his voice dripping with venomous sanctimony. And she had. She told them of the shadow and the foundations, the god that slept, the breath of stone and the silence that would consume them all. She had looked directly at Valerius, her gaze piercing. You will be its first and most willing herald. I see the emptiness in you, priest, the void where your faith should be. You will kneel to it. The memory shifted, sharpened by the Umbral's cruel clarity. She saw what her physical eyes had missed that day. As she spoke those words, a flicker in Valerius's eyes, not of anger, but of recognition. A dark, hungry joy. He had wanted her to see. Her prophecy was not a threat to him. It was a confirmation. He had already heard the whispers. He had already knelt. Then the searing, world-ending pain as the brand was pressed into her eyes. But through the agony, a new vision, granted by the very darkness they sought to blind her to. Valerius, watching, his lips moving in a silent, ecstatic prayer, not to the lunar goddess, but to the pain itself, to the silencing of the one voice that could name his betrayal. The vision shattered, leaving Morana gasping in the present. The truth was a cold knife in her soul. She had not been punished for a lie, but for a truth that was too inconvenient, too dangerous for the powers of the world. And Valerius, he had not just allowed it, he had sanctified it. The door to her cell groaned open, but it was not Kaelin. The air itself changed, growing heavy and cold, saturated with the scent of sanctified incense, now turned cloying and funereal. The footsteps were measured, deliberate, the click of heels on stone a mockery of holy procession. Morana, a voice said. It was Valerius. His tone was not that of a jailer come to gloat, nor an executioner come to threaten. It was reverent. She did not turn. You come to see your handiwork, priest? Or has the void in your own soul grown so vast that you seek to fill it with the sight of mine? A soft, chilling laugh echoed in the small space. My handiwork. No, seer. This. She heard a gesture, encompassing her, the cell, her scars, was a necessary pruning. The vessel had to be cleansed of earthly sight to be fit for a truer vision. You were always the key, the unblinking eye. I merely helped to sharpen your focus. He moved closer. She could feel the psychic chill that radiated from him, a vortex of ambition and devotion to the absolute zero of the Umbral. The king thinks to burn you, Valerius continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A petty, mortal end for a tool of divine will. He understands nothing. The echoes in the plaza, that was but the first note of a glorious symphony. The Umbral stirs, but it requires a guide, a lens through which to focus its magnificent will upon this flawed creation. Finally, Morana turned her scarred face towards him. Through the web of whispers, she saw him, not as a man, but as a conduit, just as she was. Where she was a clear channel, he was a tangled knot of fanaticism and personal desire, a flawed instrument playing a perfect, destructive song. You believe it will make you a god, she stated, the simplicity of the statement stripping bare the grandeur of his ambition. It will unmake the concept of me entirely, he corrected, his voice trembling with fervor. And in that glorious oblivion, I will be part of something absolute. No more doubt, no more weak, squabbling kings or faithless masses. Only the perfect, silent truth. And you, Morana, you will be the one to show us the way. Your sight will illuminate the path to our collective unmaking. He was not there to kill her. He was there to recruit her, to worship her as the high priestess of the end. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted outside the door, the clash of steel, a shout of alarm that was abruptly cut short. Valerius's serene composure cracked for a single instant, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. The door was shoved open again, and Kaelin stood there, his sword drawn, his chest heaving. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. The high priest, standing over the seated seer. Step away from her, Kaelin growled, his voice tight with a courage he had to dredge from the depths of his soul. Valerius looked from Kaelin back to Morana, his beatific smile returning. The fledgling guards its broken nest. How mortal, He swept past Kalen without another glance, as if the young man and his sword were of no more consequence than a speck of dust. Consider my offer, seer. The pyre or the pinnacle. The choice is, as it has always been, yours. He was gone, his chilling presence lingering in the air like a poison. Kalen rushed to Morana's side. What did he want? What did he say to you? Morana was silent for a long moment, the high priest's words echoing in the vast, dark cathedral of her mind. The king saw her as a ghost to be exorcised. The prince saw her as a symbol of his father's weakness. But Valerius saw her for what she truly was. He did not come to threaten me, boy, she said, her voice eerily calm. He came to offer me a crown of absolute nothingness. The game had changed. She was no longer a prisoner to be executed. She was a prize to be claimed by the rising dark. The air in the tower cell was thick with the aftermath of Valerius's visit, the high priest's offer hanging like a shroud of ice. Morana sat in silence, the two paths before her, the king's pyre or the high priest's void, etched into the darkness behind her scars. But a third path, faint and treacherous, was beginning to glimmer. It required movement. It required escape. Kalen, his heart still hammering from confronting the high priest, knew it too. The fragile truce he had maintained with his duty had shattered the moment Valerius had entered this cell. He was no longer a guardsman. He was an accomplice. "We have to get you out of here," he whispered, the words tasting of treason. "Now, before the king signs the execution order or Valerius returns with other means of persuasion." Morana gave a slow, deliberate nod. The spider weaves his web in the shadows. Malachir will not let the king hesitate for long. And Valerius, his patience is a pretense. He will take what he needs if I do not give it freely. The plan was born of desperation. Kalen's shift ended at the changing of the guard at midnight. He would return then, with a hooded cloak to conceal her. The route was a gamble, down the seldom-used servant stair that wound inside the temple's outer wall, emerging near the old granaries, and from there into the labyrinth of the city's lower districts. They would seek refuge in the one place Brother Fenris had mentioned in his cryptic warnings, the Sunken Quarter, a district built atop the city's ancient, pre-temple foundations, where the walls were said to still remember older gods. It was a thin hope, but it was all they had. The moon was a sliver of bone in a starless sky when Kalen returned. He moved with a forced calm, his keys barely rattling as he unlocked the door. Sister Alara was with him, her face pale but resolute. She carried a bundle of rough-spun cloth. "No one saw us," Alara breathed, her voice trembling. The guards at the inner gate were distracted. One of the echoes was found wandering the barracks, just standing and staring. A cold dread settled in Kalen's stomach. It was a coincidence, or it was a sign that their every move was being watched. There was no time to ponder it. They draped a cloak over Morana's frail shoulders. As Kalen's hand brushed her arm, a jolt, like a static shock, went through him. A fragmented vision flashed behind his eyes, a narrow stairway, a glint of steel in the darkness, the scent of oil and rust. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving him disoriented. Morana pulled her arm away. "The path is not clear. Your own fear paints dangers in the dark." Shaken, Kalen led the way. The servant stair was a tight spiral of cold, damp stone, lit only by the single candle Alara carried. Their footsteps were swallowed by the profound silence. They descended past silent chapels and dusty storerooms, the air growing colder with every step. The plan was working. Then, as they rounded a corner near the bottom, the vision Kalen had glimpsed materialized. Lord Malachir stood in the narrow passageway, flanked by 4 of the king's personal guard, hard-faced men with no loyalty to the temple, only to coin and command. They were not echoes. Their eyes were sharp, calculating, and cruel. Malachir held a small, wicked-looking dagger, cleaning his fingernails with its point. "Kalen," Malachir said, his voice a silken trap in the confined space. "I had such high hopes for you. A promising guardsman, throwing his life away for a blind hag." His eyes flickered to Alara, and a sister of the temple, no less. TSK, Valerius will be so disappointed. They were trapped. The stair behind them was a dead end, and Malaker's men blocked the only way out. "You serve a dying king, Malaker," Kalen said, his sword held before him, its tip wavering. "I serve the future," Malaker corrected smoothly. "A future where power is not dictated by prophecy or piety, but by the will of those smart enough to seize it. The king is a puppet. Valerius is a fanatic. When they have finished tearing each other apart, someone will need to pick up the pieces." He smiled. "That someone will be me, and delivering the traitorous seer to the executioner's block will be a most convincing first step." He gestured with the dagger. "Take the seer. Kill the others." The guards advanced. In that moment, Morana did not speak. She did not plead. She simply reached. She reached not with her hands, but with her mind, into the web of whispers that connected her to the stones, to the sleeping god in the deep, to the very shadows that clung to the walls. And the shadows answered. The candle in Alara's hand flared and died, plunging them into absolute blackness. But it was not a passive dark. It was an aggressive, living thing. From the corners of the stairwell, tendrils of deeper darkness uncoiled, moving with the liquid speed. They wrapped around the ankles of the advancing guards, cold and solid as iron bands. Shouts of confusion and terror erupted, turning to choked gurgles as the shadows snaked up their bodies, covering their mouths, their noses. The men thrashed, their swords clattering uselessly against the stone steps, fighting an enemy they could not see or cut. Kalen and Alara stood frozen, huddled around Morana, witnesses to a power that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. They could see nothing, but they could hear the struggle, the muffled screams, the final, sickening crunch of bone. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The oppressive darkness receded, leaving only the faint moonlight from a grate above. The four guards lay in broken heaps on the stairs, their limbs twisted at impossible angles, their faces frozen in a rictus of terror. Their eyes were wide and empty. Lord Malaker was gone. A scrap of his fine cloak, torn and caught on a jagged piece of stone, was the only evidence he had ever been there. He had fled into the deeper darkness, a spider scurrying from a greater predator. Morana swayed on her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The use of such direct power had cost her. A trickle of blood seeped from one of her scarred sockets. "He's gone," she panted. "The coward survives." Kalen looked from the dead guards to the blind seer, a new, profound fear warring with a surge of hope. She was not just a victim. She was a weapon, and they had just unleashed her. "The way is clear," Morana said, her voice regaining its iron composure. "But we must hurry. He will sound the alarm. The hunt has begun." They stumbled out of the stairwell and into the cold night air, leaving the carnage behind. They were free of the tower, but they were now fugitives in a city where the stones had ears, the shadows had teeth, and every face could be that of an enemy. The air in the sunken quarter was a broth of decay and forgotten memories. They had taken refuge in a crumbling shell of a house, its foundations sunk deep into the city's primordial bones. The walls wept a constant, damp chill, and the only sounds were the distant, maddening chorus of the echoes and the frantic skittering of rats. Kalen stood watch at a boarded-up window, his knuckles white on the hilt of his sword. Every shadow seemed to writhe with a life of its own after what he had witnessed in the stairwell. Alara tended to Morana, who sat shivering on the bare earth floor. The exertion of wielding the shadows had hollowed her out. The trickle of blood from her eye socket had dried, but a profound exhaustion had taken its place. "Rest, seer," Alara whispered, draping her own shawl over the old woman's thin shoulders. "Rest is a cradle for the dead," Morana rasped, but she allowed her head to loll back against the damp wall. The moment her consciousness retreated, the vision found her. It was not the cold, alien touch of the Umbral, but something older, more intimately painful. She was a child, no more than 6, standing in a family cottage at the edge of the whispering woods. The air smelled of pine needles and baking bread. Her mother, Althea, was humming, her back turned as she kneaded dough. Young Morana, her eyes wide and clear, stared at her mother's back and saw not the woman, but a shimmering, silver cord of light connecting her to the heavens. "Mama," little Morana said, her voice full of wonder, "the moon goddess is pulling your string. She wants you to dance for her." Althea had frozen. She turned slowly, her face a mask of not wonder, but terror. "Do not say such things, Morana. Do not look at such things." The memory shifted, blurred, and reformed. The cottage was gone. Now they stood in the moon temple itself, before a young, ambitious priest Valerius. Althea was on her knees, weeping. "She sees things, Holy One, impossible things. She says my father, who died before her birth, stands behind me and weeps. She says the stones in the field sing a sad song at dusk. Make it stop. Please, make the sight leave her." Valerius's eyes held a cold, calculating light. "The sight is a gift from the goddess, woman, but in a vessel unprepared, it can be a curse. We will take her. The temple will guide her." "No," Althea screamed, clutching her daughter. "Not my child." The vision shattered, dissolving into a mist of grief. And from the mist, a figure emerged. It was Althea, but not as she was in life. This was the weeping mother, a specter of perpetual sorrow, her form translucent, tears of silver light streaming down her ghostly cheeks. She hovered before the seated Morana. "My daughter." The specter's voice was the sound of wind through barren branches. "My little seer, I was so afraid. I thought I was saving you. I delivered you to the wolf to save you from the storm." In her vision, Morana was no longer a child. She was the old, blind woman, facing the ghost of her mother's regret. "You gave me to them. You let them break me and shape me into their tool." "I was blind," the weeping mother cried, her form flickering. "But you were always meant to see. Not just the future, but the truth of things. The Umbral is not what they believe. Valerius sees a weapon. The king sees a monster. But it is a part of the world, as the night is part of the day. It is the balance to the light, the silence that gives sound its meaning. It was never meant to be awakened, only acknowledged." The words struck a chord deep within Morana, resonating with the forbidden knowledge from Fenrir's archives. The Umbral Concordat, a pact, not a victory. "What must I do?" Morana asked the ghost, her voice stripped of all bitterness, leaving only a desperate need for guidance. "You cannot destroy the night," her mother whispered, drifting closer. "But you can end the long, screaming dream that has gripped it. Valerius has torn the Concordat. He has made the Umbral a ravenous beast. You must not fight it. You must not join it. You must face it. You must show it its own reflection, not the distorted image of Valerius's hunger, but the true, ancient purpose of its silence. You must make it remember the pact." "How?" "With the one thing it craves and fears," the weeping mother said, her form beginning to fade. "The one thing Valerius cannot give it. Not worship, not sacrifice, understanding." The ghost dissolved into motes of silver light, and Morana jolted back to awareness in the cold, dark room. Her body was still weary, but her mind was clearer than it had been in decades. The path was no longer a choice between a pyre and a void. It was a third, more terrifying path, reconciliation. She turned her head towards Kaelin and Alara, who were watching her with worried eyes. "The execution, the ascension, they are distractions," Morana said, her voice firm, imbued with a new, grim purpose. "We are not running to hide. We are running to the heart of the storm. We must return to the temple." Kaelin stared at her in disbelief. "Return? It's a fortress. Valerius and the king will both be waiting for us." "Precisely," Morana said, a ghost of her old, bitter smile returning. "They expect a fugitive or a supplicant. They will not be ready for an arbiter." The goal was no longer to escape the Umbral or to serve it. The goal was to heal it, and the only way to do that was to walk directly into the jaws of the beast that now, the heart of Silver Spire, was tearing itself apart. The king's order to round up the echoes had been the spark, and Valerius's chilling display in the plaza had been the kindling. Now the city was an inferno of fear and factionalism. From their precarious hiding place in the sunken quarter, Kalen, Alara, and Morana didn't need visions to feel the collapse. They could hear it. The distant, metallic clang of steel on steel echoed through the narrow streets, punctuated by screams and the crackle of fires. The unified front of the kingdom had shattered into 3 warring pieces. The king's last stand. King Theron, driven to the brink of madness, had barricaded himself in the throne room. His remaining loyal guards, their faces etched with a terror that mirrored his own, formed a shield wall before the great obsidian throne. He wore his crown, but it sat crooked on his brow, a symbol of his faltering grip. He clutched the armrests, his knuckles white, as reports filtered in of his son's insurrection and Valerius's hold on the temple. "They have all betrayed me," he roared to the empty hall, his voice echoing in the vast, cold space. "The priest, my own son, all for the words of a blind witch." He was a king of ghosts, ruling over a realm that was rapidly vanishing into the shadows he had tried so hard to eradicate. The prophecy was no longer a future threat. It was the very fabric of his present, unraveling stitch by stitch. He was finally facing the phantom, and it was wearing the faces of everyone he had ever known. The prince's furious charge. Prince Theron had made the palace courtyard his mustering ground, surrounded by his veteran soldiers, men who shared his contempt for his father's weakness and the priest's fanaticism. He was the storm given human form. The king cowers behind stone, and the priest hides behind empty souls, he bellowed, his sword held high. "We are the only steel left in this city. We will carve a path through this madness. To the temple. We will drag Valerius from his altar and show the people what happens to those who traffic with demons." His charge was not one of strategy, but of pure, unadulterated fury. He led his men in a violent push towards the temple district, cutting down any echo that shuffled into their path, and clashing violently with the pockets of the king's guard too loyal or too foolish to stand down. He fought the symptoms of the plague with brute force, blind to the disease festering at its source. The high priest's serene conquest. High Priest Valerius had not left the Moon Temple. He didn't need to. The temple was the nexus. From the central sanctum, he directed his silent army. The echoes, now numbering in the hundreds, moved with a chilling, coordinated purpose. They didn't fight with weapons. They simply advanced, an inexorable tide of hollowed-out humanity. They overwhelmed the king's guards through sheer, unnerving numbers, their silent stares and grasping hands breaking the will of soldiers trained for combat, not this surreal nightmare. Valerius stood before the altar, the Umbral's power thrumming through him. He could feel the prince's rage, the king's despair. They were a feast for the god he served. He made no move to defend the temple doors. Let the prince come. Let him enter the lion's den. It would be a fitting sacrifice. In the crumbling safe house, Morana perceived the threefold conflict not as sounds, but as discordant energies tearing at the world's weave. The king's desperate, brittle fear. The prince's hot, destructive rage. The high priest's cold, consuming hunger. The king believes he is fighting a ghost. The prince believes he is fighting a man. They are both wrong, she said, rising to her feet. Her weariness seemed to have fallen away, replaced by a fatalistic resolve. They are all fighting the same, single wound in the world, and their struggles are only making it bleed more freely. Kalen watched the old seer. The plan to return to the temple was suicide, but staying here was a slower, more certain death. The city was eating itself alive. There were no safe paths left, only purposeful ones. "The chaos will be our shield," Kalen said, surprising himself with his own calm. "While they are at each other's throats, they won't be looking for a handful of ghosts moving through the shadows." Alara nodded, her faith no longer in the institution of the temple, but in the grim, blind woman before her. The side entrance through the scriptorium. Brother Fenris might still be there. It is our only way in. They slipped out of the safe house, 3 insignificant figures in a city convulsing in its death throes. They moved through the smoke and the screams, past the clashing factions, unseen and unheeded. The throne of Silver Spire was sundered, its authority broken. The final act would not be played out in the palace or the streets, but in the sacred heart of the darkness itself. They were walking into the epicenter of the storm, not as warriors, but as would-be healers of a dying god. The scriptorium door yielded to Alara's whispered prayer, and a key she had procured from a terrified, hiding Brother Fenris. The old librarian had merely pressed it into her hand, his eyes full of a sorrowful understanding, before melting back into the shadows. They entered not a battlefield, but a tomb. The grand halls of the Moon Temple were empty, the silence within more oppressive than the chaos outside. The air was frigid, smelling of extinguished candles and a profound, static emptiness. The only light was a sickly, phosphorescent glow emanating from the walls themselves, as if the stone had been fed on moonlight and now vomited it back, corrupted. Their footsteps echoed as they moved towards the central sanctum, a procession of the doomed. Kaelin's sword felt like a child's toy. Alara's prayers died on her lips. This was no longer a place of faith. It was an altar to absence. The great doors to the sanctum were open, inviting them in. Inside, the scene was one of frozen horror. Hundreds of echoes stood packed together, motionless, their faces upturned towards the altar. They were not chanting, not moving. They were simply broadcasting, a silent, psychic scream of voided wills that pressed against Morana's mind like a physical weight. At the altar stood High Priest Valerius, but the man was gone. In his place was a vessel stretched to its breaking point. His eyes were pools of liquid night, and the same darkness seeped from his pores, swirling around him in a languid, malevolent shroud. The Umbral was no longer just using him. It was wearing him. Morana. The voice that came from him was a chorus, the dry rustle of dead leaves mixed with the whispers of the echoes and Valerius's own frayed tenor. You have come to witness. You have come to see the world unmade. I have come to show you what you have forgotten, Morana stated, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the psychic static. She walked forward, Kaelin and Alara hovering protectively behind her. Forgotten? The chorus laughed, a sound that cracked the marble floor at Valerius's feet. I am becoming everything. I am the silence at the end of all stories. You are a broken promise, Morana replied, stopping at the foot of the dais. She could feel the Umbral's consciousness, a vast, wounded, and furious thing, so much more than the mere destroyer Valerius believed it to be. It was the counterweight, the necessary shadow, driven mad by its long, forced slumber and the violent manner of its awakening. You are the quiet, the keeper of lost things, the balance to the light's noise. The Concordat was not your prison. It was your purpose. A wave of rage emanated from the entity, slamming into them. Kaelin cried out, dropping to one knee. Alara gasped, clutching her head. Morana merely swayed, accepting the blow. Lies. The pact was chains. I will be silent no more. This is not your voice. Morana shouted, gesturing to the silent, screaming echoes, to the corrupted Valerius. This is his. The hunger of a small, ambitious man. You have consumed his poison and think it your own nature. Look deeper. She did not raise her hands in a spell. She did not summon shadows. Instead, she closed her mind to the torrent of rage and opened herself completely. She lowered every shield, every defense, and offered up not a challenge, but a memory. She showed the Umbral what she had seen in the Black Archives, not as history, but as truth. The signing of the Concordat, not as a victory, but as a solemn agreement between two necessary parts of a whole. The moon goddess for creation, growth, and light. The Umbral for endings, silence, and rest. One could not exist without the other. She poured into the connection the vision of her mother, the weeping mother, speaking of balance. She showed the world as it was meant to be. Day and night, sound and silence, life and a peaceful, welcome death. For a moment, the chorus of voices faltered. The darkness around Valerius writhed in confusion. No, Valerius's own voice screamed, fighting for control. This is my triumph. I gave you this world. You gave it a cancer, Morana said, her voice filled with a pity that was far more devastating than any hatred. And the cancer must be cut out. She turned her perception, her sight, not on the vastness of the Umbral, but on the tiny, screaming knot of human ego that was Valerius, tangled at its core. She focused on his ambition, his pride, his fanaticism, and she showed these things to the Umbral. She reflected Valerius's own poisoned soul back into the heart of the darkness. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Umbral recoiled. It saw the impurity, the chaotic, selfish hunger that had twisted its reawakening. With a violent, reflexive spasm of its vast power, it purged the infection. Valerius's body arched backwards. A scream, entirely his own, tore from his throat. A sound of utter, absolute betrayal. The darkness ripped itself out of him, not in a controlled stream, but in an explosive burst. He crumpled to the altar, a desiccated, empty husk, his eyes wide with the horror of his own insignificance. The echoes, all at once, collapsed like marionettes with their strings cut. The oppressive silence shattered, replaced by the weak, confused sobs and whimpers of hundreds of people waking from a collective nightmare. The swirling darkness of the Umbral hung in the air above the altar, confused, wounded, but cleansed of Valerius's influence. It was no longer a raging beast, but a lost, weary giant. Morana, her life force spent as the final conduit for this cosmic reconciliation, sank to her knees. The last of her vision faded, the world narrowing to a pinprick of feeling. She felt a final, gentle touch against her mind. Not a whisper, but a sigh of gratitude, of remembrance. And then, profound, deep silence descended, not just in the sanctum, but in the world itself. The stones stopped breathing. The balance, however fragile, was restored. Kaelin rushed to her side, catching her as she fell backward. Her scarred face was peaceful, empty of pain or prophecy. "Is it over?" Ilara asked, her voice trembling as she looked at the freed people and the quiet, empty air above the altar. Morana did not answer. She could not see the dawning light of a new day filtering through the sanctum's high windows. She could not see Kaelin and Ilara, the new guardians of a broken world, looking down at her with a mixture of grief and awe. She had given her last vision, her last sight, to heal a god. In the end, the blind seer saw only darkness. But for the first time in 81 years, it was a peaceful, silent dark, and it was enough. Thank you for watching. First of all, the stories we tell are either entirely fictional or inspired by real events. If you have any stories you'd like to share with us, let's chat in the comment section. If you liked our story, we'd appreciate it if you gave our video a like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on our next videos. You can check out the playlist created for other stories on our channel in the card section at the top right. See you in the next video.